The sky above Velros burned red with the fires of a dying world. Minho pressed his hands against the cracked console, trying to coax one last transmission from the failing equipment. Around him, the communications center shook as another wave of enemy ships passed overhead. The walls groaned under the stress of the bombardment. "Sir, the main transmitter is down," called out Operator Yuna from across the room. Her voice shook with fear and exhaustion. They had been fighting for 3 days straight, and everyone knew this was their last stand. Minho wiped sweat from his forehead and looked at the dying screens around him. The Vellani Empire had ruled 3 star systems for over 2,000 years. Their technology was advanced, their fleets were strong, and their people were proud. But none of that mattered now. The Keth had come like a plague of locusts, consuming everything in their path. "What about the backup systems?" Minho asked, though he already knew the answer. The backup transmitters had been destroyed in the first wave of attacks 2 days ago. "Only the old radio array is still working," Yuna replied. She sounded defeated. "But that can only send signals to nearby worlds. Nothing past our own system." Minho felt his heart sink. The old radio system was a relic from their early space age. It used primitive waves that could barely reach beyond their solar system. Any civilization that might help them would have technology far beyond simple radio signals. They would never be listening to such basic frequencies. But it was all they had outside. The sounds of battle grew closer. The capital city of Velros was falling block by block. The Keth did not just conquer worlds, they consumed them. They ate the people, drained the oceans, and stripped away the atmosphere. When they were done, nothing would remain but a dead rock floating in space. "Sir, should we evacuate?" asked Yuna. Her eyes were wide with terror as another explosion shook the building. Minho looked at her young face and felt a weight settle on his shoulders. He was 43 years old and had spent his whole career in peaceful communications. He had never imagined he would be sending out desperate calls for help while his world died around him. "No," he said firmly. "We stay. Someone needs to tell the galaxy what happened here." He began working on the old radio array, adjusting frequencies and boosting power. The system was so ancient that he had to remember training from decades ago. His fingers moved over controls that his grandfather might have recognized. Captain Jiwan's voice crackled through the emergency comm system. "All remaining ships, this is your captain speaking. We're making one final run to buy time for the distress signal. All civilian transports, begin evacuation immediately." Minho's hands froze over the controls. Jiwan commanded the last surviving. Vellani cruiser, the Star of Hope. She had already lost 2 ships under her command. Now she was sacrificing herself and her crew to give him a few more minutes. "I won't waste this chance," he whispered to himself. The radio array hummed to life with more power than it had used in 50 years. Minho began recording his message in the universal mathematical language that all spacefaring civilizations understood. He spoke of the Keth invasion, their terrible hunger, and the fall of the Vellani worlds. He included star maps, tactical information, and warnings about what was coming. But most importantly, he begged for help. "To anyone who receives this message," he said in his own language, hoping the translation programs would work. "We are the Vellani of the Velros system. We are under attack by an enemy that consumes entire worlds. They call themselves the Keth. Our defenses have failed. Our fleet is destroyed. Please, if anyone can hear this, send help. Don't let our civilization die forgotten." As he spoke, he could see through the broken windows that the sky was full of Keth ships. They looked like giant insects made of black, metal, and flesh. Some were as large as cities, their hulls pulsing with organic growth. Smaller ships swarmed around them like angry wasps. The Star of Hope streaked across the sky, firing everything she had at the enemy formation. Captain Jiwan was buying him precious seconds with the lives of her crew. Minho's throat tightened with emotion, but he forced himself to keep recording. He sent the message on every frequency the old array could reach. Short wave, long wave, everything in between. He broadcast it toward the galactic center where most civilizations lived. He aimed it at promising star systems that might harbor intelligent life. He even sent it toward the outer rim where primitive worlds might be developing radio technology. The message went out again and again, an endless loop of desperation cast into the void. Through the chaos outside, Minho heard the distinctive whine of Keth energy weapons powering up. The main hive ship was preparing to fire on the capital. Once that beam hit, nothing would survive. "Yuna, get to the shelters," he ordered. "What about you, sir?" Minho looked at his console, still broadcasting their plea across the galaxy. "Someone needs to keep the signal going as long as possible. Go. Run." Yuna hesitated for a moment, then saluted and ran for the emergency exits. Minho was alone with his equipment and his desperate hope. The building shook as the Keth beam carved through the city center, only a few blocks away. Minho could feel the heat through the walls. His equipment sparked and smoked, but the old radio array kept working. Built to survive anything, it had outlasted the most advanced technology of his civilization. In space, the Star of Hope made her final attack run. Captain Ji-won's ship was torn apart by enemy fire, but not before her weapons found their mark. One of the smaller Keth ships exploded in a brilliant flash that lit up the dying world below. It was a small victory, but it bought Minho a few more minutes. He adjusted the transmission one last time, boosting the power to dangerous levels. The old equipment groaned under the strain, but it held together. His message continued to race across the galaxy at the speed of light, carrying the story of the Villani and their final stand. What Minho didn't know was that his signal had already traveled farther than he dared hope. In a distant corner of the galaxy, on a small blue world called Earth, a young man named Sayok was working the night shift at a radio telescope. The primitive waves that seemed so useless to Minho were exactly what human technology was built to detect. The last thing Minho saw was the Keth hive ship's main weapon powering up above the city. He smiled, knowing his message was still traveling through space. Somewhere out there, someone would hear their cry for help. He just hoped they would care enough to answer. Sayok rubbed his tired eyes and looked at the clock on his computer screen. 3 in the morning. He had been monitoring radio signals from space for 6 hours straight, and his shift still had 3 more hours to go. Working the night shift at the Arecibo Observatory was lonely work, but someone had to listen to the universe. Most nights, he heard nothing but cosmic background noise and the occasional burst from a distant star. Tonight was different. For the past hour, he had been picking up something strange, a repeating signal that definitely wasn't natural. The patterns were too complex, too organized. At first, he thought it might be interference from a satellite or maybe someone's illegal radio broadcast. But as he analyzed the signal more carefully, his sleepiness disappeared completely. This wasn't coming from Earth. The signal was arriving from deep space, and it contained mathematical sequences that made his heart race. Prime numbers. Fibonacci sequences. The value of pi calculated to 50 decimal places. No natural phenomenon could create patterns like these. This was a message from an intelligent civilization. Sayok's hands shook as he recorded everything and began running the signal through translation programs. The computer worked for 20 minutes, trying to decode the alien mathematics. When the first translated words appeared on his screen, he nearly fell out of his chair. "Help us! We are dying! Enemy consuming our world!" With growing horror, Sayok watched more of the message become clear. The aliens called themselves Villani. They were under attack by something called the Keth. Their cities were burning. Their people were being killed. They were sending this message as their last hope, begging anyone who heard it to send help. The message included star maps showing the location of their world. Siak cross-referenced the coordinates with human star charts. The Volani system was over 200 light-years away, farther than any human had ever traveled, but not impossibly far with their new jump drive technology. Siak stared at the screen for a long moment, trying to process what he was seeing. Humanity's first contact with alien life wasn't going to be a peaceful meeting between explorers. It was a desperate cry for help from a dying civilization. He reached for his phone with trembling fingers and called his supervisor, Dr. Hyan. "This better be important, Siak," came the grumpy voice on the other end. "It's 3 in the morning, Doctor." "Hyun, you need to get here right now," Siak said, his voice barely controlled. "I'm receiving a distress signal from an alien civilization." There was a long pause. "Siok, have you been drinking?" "I'm completely serious, sir. I have mathematical proofs, star charts, everything. They're real, and they're asking for help. 20. Minutes later, Dr. Hyan arrived at the observatory with coffee and skepticism. The skepticism disappeared quickly when he saw Siak's data. Within an hour, both men were on a secure phone line to the director of the National Science Foundation. By dawn, the message had reached the highest levels of the American government. President Yoonji stared at the translated message on her secure tablet as she walked into the emergency meeting room in the White House basement. Around the table sat the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the heads of NASA and the Space Force, and the Secretary of Defense. Every face in the room was grim. "Is this verified?" she asked, taking her seat at the head of the table. "Multiple observatories have confirmed the signal," replied Dr. Kim, the science advisor. "The mathematical proofs check out. The astronomical data is accurate. This is definitely from an alien civilization, and they're definitely in trouble." Admiral Wu Jin of the Space Force leaned forward. "Madame President, we need to respond immediately. If these Keth are consuming entire civilizations, they represent a threat to all life in the galaxy, including Earth." General Soman shook her head. "We don't know anything about the scale of this conflict. For all we know, we could be jumping into a war between galactic empires. Our entire fleet might not be enough to make a difference." "Our fleet is bigger than you think," Admiral Wu Jin replied quietly. President Yoonji raised an eyebrow. "Explain." The Admiral touched his tablet, and a holographic display appeared above the conference table. It showed the solar system, but not the version most people knew. Hidden bases dotted the asteroid belt. Secret shipyards orbited behind Jupiter's moons. Massive structures that had been disguised as mining operations revealed their true purpose. "For the past 30 years, every administration has prepared for this day," Admiral Wu Jin explained. "We always assumed first contact would be hostile. We've been building a war fleet in secret, using cover stories about asteroid mining and scientific research. The hologram showed ships emerging from hidden bays, dreadnoughts the size of cities, carrier ships loaded with fighter squadrons, destroyers bristling with weapons that had never been tested in actual combat." "How many ships?" asked President Yoonji. 237 capital ships, over 800 support vessels, and the Indomitable." The Admiral's voice carried deep pride when he spoke the last name. A new image appeared in the hologram. It was a ship unlike anything the President had ever seen. Over a kilometer long, bristling with weapons, and built like a flying fortress. It looked like humanity's answer to the question of what happened when a peaceful species decided to prepare for war. "The Indomitable is under the command of Captain June," Admiral Wu Jin continued. "She's the most experienced combat commander in the Space Force, even though she's never fought in a real war." General Somin still looked concerned. "This could be a trap. We don't know anything about alien psychology or politics. What if we're being manipulated?" President Yoonji studied the translated message again. She could feel the desperation in every word, the genuine fear of a civilization facing extinction. But beyond that, she could see something else. Opportunity. For decades, humanity had wondered if they were alone in the universe. Now they knew they weren't, and their first alien neighbors needed help. How humanity responded to this crisis would define their place in the galaxy for generations to come. "How long to prepare the fleet?" she asked. 72 hours, Admiral Wu Jin replied immediately. "We've been running mobilization drills for years." The president looked around the table at the faces of her advisors. Some showed fear, others excitement. All of them understood that this moment would change everything. "Admiral Wu Jin, you have authorization to mobilize the fleet. We're going to answer that distress call." "Madam President," General Somin interjected, "we should consider the political implications. If we save this alien civilization, we'll be announcing humanity's existence to the entire galaxy. There's no going back from that." President Yunji smiled grimly. "General, if these Keth are really consuming entire civilizations, they're eventually going to find Earth anyway. I'd rather meet them over someone else's world with the biggest fleet we can build." She stood up, and everyone in the room came to attention. "Gentlemen, we're about to answer humanity's first interstellar distress call. I want our response to send a clear message to anyone watching. Earth protects its friends, and we don't abandon people who ask for our help." As the meeting broke up, Admiral Wu Jin was already sending coded messages to hidden bases throughout the solar system. Within hours, the greatest military mobilization in human history was underway. Ships that had never seen sunlight emerged from asteroid bases. Crews that had trained for decades finally received their real orders. The Villani had called out desperately into the void, hoping someone, anyone, would hear their plea for help. They were about to discover that humans don't just answer distress calls. They answer them with overwhelming force and absolute commitment. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when humanity decided to make friends, and the Keth were about to learn why that was the worst possible news for them. Hayuk floated in the twisted wreckage of the morning light, trying to stay hidden among the debris that had once been the Villani Third Fleet. Through his helmet's cracked visor, he watched the Keth ships move like hungry predators through the ruins of his homeworld's orbital defenses. 5 days had passed since the final transmission from the surface. 5 days since Minho's desperate message had gone silent. 5 days of watching the Keth harvest his people like crops. The Keth ships were horrible to look at. They weren't built like normal spacecraft. They were grown. Black metal and flesh twisted together in patterns that hurt to see. Some looked like giant insects with too many legs. Others resembled deep-sea creatures with glowing organs pulsing beneath translucent skin. The largest ones were the size of cities, their hulls covered in what looked like mouths that never stopped moving. Hyuk had been hiding here for 3 days, surviving on emergency rations and recycled air. His ship's power was almost gone. Soon his life support would fail, and he would join the millions who had already died. At least it would be quick. He was checking his oxygen levels when space itself seemed to tear open. The first jump point appeared without warning, a hole in reality that blazed with blue light. Then another, and another. Within seconds, dozens of these portals were opening all around the Velros system. But these weren't the sickly green tears that Keth ships used to travel between stars. These were different, cleaner, more controlled. Ships began emerging from the jump points, and Hayek's breath caught in his throat. They were beautiful in a way that Keth vessels never could be. Clean lines of metal and ceramic, painted in colors that spoke of pride rather than hunger. White hulls marked with blue symbols. Gray warships that looked like they were built by people who understood both engineering and art. But it was the sheer number of them that made Hayek's heart race. Dozens of ships, then hundreds. They kept coming through the jump points in perfect formation, like they had practiced this maneuver 1,000 times. The largest ship to emerge was magnificent and terrifying at the same time. Over 1 kilometer long, it bristled with weapon systems that Hayek didn't recognize. Across its hull, painted in bold letters, was a single word: indomitable. On the bridge of the destroyer Retribution, Commander Bora watched her tactical display light up like a festival. Thousands of red dots representing Keth ships scattered across the system. They weren't in battle formation. They were spread out like they were conducting a harvest operation. "They're not expecting a fight," she said to her weapons officer, Lieutenant Do-hyun. "That's about to change," he replied, checking his targeting systems. Admiral Wu Jin's voice came through the fleet communications. "All ships, this is Fleet Command. The Keth forces are in harvest configuration, not battle formation. They're vulnerable. All vessels, weapons free. Show them why you don't threaten human friends." Bora smiled grimly. "You heard the Admiral. All weapons. Target the nearest Keth vessel. Fire when ready." The human fleet opened fire with coordinated precision that would have impressed any military observer. Kinetic projectiles traveling at significant fractions of light speed tore through. Keth bioships that had seemed unstoppable against Vellani plasma weapons. Fusion missiles designed to crack asteroids turned the smaller Keth vessels into clouds of expanding debris. The Keth had never faced an enemy like this. For thousands of years, they had fought civilizations that used energy weapons and defensive shields. They had evolved armor that could absorb plasma blasts and hulls that could regenerate from laser damage. They had no defense against solid projectiles moving at relativistic speeds. Jimin pulled his fighter into a steep dive, leading his squadron toward a cluster of Keth escort ships. The enemy vessels were trying to form a defensive formation, but they moved too slowly. Their bioships were built for consuming worlds, not for dogfighting with nimble human interceptors. "Fox Squadron, engage at will," he called over his radio. "Remember your training. These things are tough, but they're not fast." His targeting computer locked onto a Keth ship that looked like a flying centipede. Its hull was covered in what appeared to be organic armor that pulsed with its own heartbeat. Jimin fired a burst from his particle cannon, and the energy beam sliced through the creature ship like it was made of paper. "That's one bug down," he reported. "These things aren't as tough as they look." Around him, his squadron mates were having similar success. The Keth ships were built to overwhelm primitive defenses through sheer numbers and terrifying appearance. Against disciplined human pilots using superior technology, they were sitting targets. In the flagship Indomitable, Captain June watched the battle unfold on the main display. The Keth fleet was collapsing faster than her tactical officers had predicted. These aliens might be good at consuming helpless civilizations, but they clearly weren't prepared for a real fight. "Communications, are we picking up any signals from the planet's surface?" she asked. "Negative, Captain," replied Lieutenant Kiwan. "All Vellani transmissions ceased 5 days ago, but we are detecting life signs in the orbital debris. Survivors, Captain." June nodded. "Launch search and rescue operations. I want every survivor found and brought aboard. And send a message to the surviving Keth vessels. They have one chance to surrender before we destroy them all." On the planet's surface, Dayan crouched in the ruins of what had once been the central library of Corvin City. She had been hiding here for days, surviving on rainwater and whatever food she could scavenge from the wreckage. Above her, the sky had been full of Keth ships for so long that she had almost forgotten what normal stars looked like. But now, something was different. The constant rumble of Keth harvesters had stopped. The sky was lit up with explosions, but they weren't the green flashes of Keth weapons. These were different colors, white and blue and brilliant orange. She crawled to a broken window and looked up. The sky was full of burning debris, but it wasn't falling toward the planet. It was moving away, scattered by explosions that came from weapons she didn't recognize. A new ship passed overhead, sleek and white with unfamiliar markings. It moved with purpose, not the lazy confidence of the Keth harvesters. Behind it came others, all painted in the same clean colors. Someone was fighting the Keth. Someone was winning. Dayon began to cry for the first time since the invasion began. She didn't know who these new ships belonged to, but they were destroying the monsters that had killed her world. After 5 days of nothing but terror and death, she finally had something she had thought was lost forever. Hope. Back in the orbital debris, Hayuk watched a human search and rescue ship approach his hiding place. The vessel was smaller than the warships, painted white with red crosses that somehow conveyed medical assistance even across species barriers. A voice came through his emergency radio, speaking in accented but understandable Vallani. "This is the human vessel Mercy. We are here to help. Do not be afraid." Hyuk almost laughed. After 5 days of watching his civilization die, fear was the last thing on his mind. Relief, amazement, gratitude, but not fear. "This is Commander." "Hyuk of the Vallani Third Fleet," he replied. "I am alive and in need of assistance." "Understood, Commander. We are coming to get you. Hold tight." As the rescue ship's tractor beam gently pulled his damaged fighter toward safety, Hyuk looked out at the battle still raging around them. The human ships moved with a precision and purpose that reminded him of his own fleet in its prime. But there was something else. Something in the way they fought that spoke of deeper principles. These humans weren't just here to fight. They were here to save people. They had come to a distant star system to help aliens they had never met. Simply because those aliens had asked for help, the Keth had made a terrible mistake when they chose to attack the Vallani. They had assumed, like all their previous victims, that the galaxy was full of civilizations who would hide and hope the monsters passed them by. Instead, they had encountered the one species that responded to cries for help by bringing overwhelming force and absolute commitment to the fight. The harvest of Velros was over. The war between the Keth and humanity was about to begin. The human medical bay was unlike anything Hayuk had ever seen. Clean white walls, bright lights that didn't hurt his eyes, and equipment that hummed quietly with efficient power. After 5 days hiding in a dying ship, breathing recycled air that tasted of fear and desperation, the Mercy felt like paradise. Dr. Sunmi worked carefully on his injuries, using instruments that seemed to know exactly what his alien biology needed. Her hands were gentle but confident, and she spoke in soothing tones even though he couldn't understand most of her words. "The translation program is still learning your language," explained the human xenobiologist who had introduced himself as Taman. "But we should be able to talk normally soon." Hyuk studied Taman's face with curiosity. The human looked fragile compared to most Vallani, smaller bones, thinner skin, no natural armor plating. But his eyes held an intelligence that reminded Hyuk of his own species' best scholars. These humans might look weak, but they clearly weren't stupid. "Why did you come?" Hyuk asked in his own language, hoping the translation would work. Taman's tablet beeped, displaying the converted words. The human smiled and replied, "Because you asked for help. But we are strangers. Our worlds are hundreds of light years apart. You gained nothing by helping us." The translation program worked both ways, and Hayuk could see Taman considering his answer carefully. "On Earth, we have a saying," Taman finally replied. "No one is a stranger when they're in trouble. Your people called out for help, so we came." It's that simple. Hyuk felt his throat tighten with emotion. In all his years serving the Vallani Empire, he had never encountered such a concept. Civilizations helped their allies because of treaties and trade agreements. They helped their colonies because of economic interests. But helping complete strangers simply because they asked, it was unthinkable. The Keth will not understand this, Hyuk warned. They consume civilizations. They do not negotiate or retreat. If you fight them, they will never stop hunting you. Taman's smile became harder, more determined. "Then we'd better make sure we win." 3 hours later, Hyuk found himself in a conference room aboard the massive human flagship. The room was full of beings that shouldn't exist, humans and Vallani sitting together like old friends, sharing information and making plans. Admiral Wu Jin sat at the head of the table, his weathered face showing the kind of calm confidence that came from years of military command. Beside him, Captain Jun reviewed tactical displays with the intensity of a born warrior. Around the table sat human officers, Volani survivors, and even a few beings from other species that the humans had, apparently rescued from previous Keth attacks. "Commander Hayuk," Admiral Wu Jin said through the translation system, "we need to understand what we're facing. Tell us everything you know about the Keth." Hayuk took a deep breath and began describing the nightmare that had consumed his civilization. The Keth weren't just conquerors. They were a plague. They arrived in massive hive fleets, overwhelmed planetary defenses, and then systematically consumed every living thing on the worlds they conquered. "They don't just kill," he explained. "They eat everything, people, animals, plants, even the microbes in the soil. When they're finished with a world, nothing remains but empty rock." "How many worlds have they taken?" asked Captain Jun. "Dozens, maybe hundreds. They've been expanding across this region of the galaxy for over 1,000 years. Every civilization that tried to fight them was destroyed." The humans exchanged glances that Hyuk couldn't interpret. He expected to see fear or despair in their faces. Instead, he saw something that looked almost like anticipation. "How many ships in a typical Keth fleet?" Admiral Wu Jin asked. "The hive fleets vary in size. Small ones have maybe 500 vessels. The largest ones we've seen had over 3,000. "Interesting," said Captain Jun, making notes on her tablet. "Our intelligence estimates were close. Neon, what did we learn from the captured Keth specimens?" A human woman at the far end of the table looked up from her own display. Intelligence Officer Neon had been working with captured Keth organisms for the past 6 hours, trying to understand their biology and psychology. "They're not entirely biological," she reported. "Part organic, part artificial. They seem to be controlled by a distributed intelligence. Individual ships don't make independent decisions. They're more like fingers of a larger hand." "So if we cut off the hand," Admiral Wu Jin began. "The fingers stop working," Neon confirmed. "But finding the control centers won't be easy. The command structure is hidden deep in the largest hive ships." Hayuk listened to this exchange with growing amazement. These humans had been fighting the Keth for less than a day, and they were already analyzing their enemy like scientists studying a new species of insect. The Volani had fought the Keth for months without learning half as much. "Commander Hyuk," Admiral Wu Jin said, turning back to him, "we need star charts showing Keth territorial expansion. We want to locate their other fleets." "You want to find more of them?" Hayuk couldn't hide his shock. "Admiral, you don't understand. The fleet that attacked Velros was relatively small. The main Keth forces are enormous. If you seek them out, they will destroy you." The humans around the table looked at each other again. This time, Hayuk was sure he saw them trying not to smile. "Commander," Captain Jun said gently, "what you saw today was our rapid response force. It's not our main fleet. I don't understand." Taman leaned forward, his tablet displaying images that made Hayuk's eyes widen. Shipyards the size of moons, construction facilities that could build dozens of massive warships simultaneously, fleet formations that stretched from one end of a star system to the other. "We've been preparing for this war for 30 years, Taman explained. "We always assumed that first contact would be hostile, so we built accordingly. What you saw today was just the first wave." Hayuk stared at the images in disbelief. The human industrial capacity was staggering. They weren't just building ships. They were building entire fleets with the efficiency of a species that had turned warfare into both science and art. "But why?" he asked. "Why prepare so extensively for a war you weren't sure would ever come?" Admiral Wu Jin's expression became serious. "Because we learned from our own history, Commander. On Earth, the civilizations that survived were the ones that prepared for the worst, while hoping for the best. When we reached the stars, we decided to apply that lesson on a galactic scale. Captain June touched her tablet, and a new display appeared in the center of the table. It showed the local region of the galaxy, with Keth-controlled space marked in red. The crimson stain covered dozens of star systems and appeared to be growing steadily toward the spiral arm that contained Earth. "We didn't just come here to save the Volani," she said quietly. "According to our analysis of their expansion pattern, the Keth would have reached Earth within 50 years. By responding to your distress call, we're fighting them on your territory instead of ours." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed this information. Hayek felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the full implications of what the humans were saying. "You're not just rescuing us," he whispered. "You're protecting yourselves." "We're protecting everyone," Admiral Wu Jin corrected. "The Keth represent a threat to all intelligent life in the galaxy. If we don't stop them here, they'll eventually consume every civilization in their path." Neon looked up from her analysis station. "Admiral, I've completed the initial interrogation of the captured Keth specimens. You need to see this." A new image appeared on the central display, a star map showing the Keth's long-term expansion plans. The red zone of their territory extended like grasping fingers toward every populated region of the galaxy. "They're not just expanding randomly," Neon explained. "They have detailed intelligence on every major civilization. They know about the Terran Republic, the Centauri worlds, even some species we haven't made contact with yet. Earth was always on their target list." Admiral Wu Jin studied the map with the expression of a man who had just confirmed his worst fears. "How long until their main fleets arrive in this region?" "Based on their current expansion rate, maybe 6 months," Neon replied. "But that assumes they don't accelerate their schedule after learning about us." Captain June stood up, and every human in the room came to attention. "Then we'd better move fast," she said. "Hayuk, we need those star charts and everything you know about Keth fleet movements. We're going to hit them before they're ready for us." Hyuk looked around the room at the faces of his new allies, humans and Volani, former strangers now united by necessity and mutual respect. For the first time since the invasion began, he felt something that had seemed impossible just days ago. He felt like his people might actually survive. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when humanity decided to take a personal interest in protecting their neighbors. And the Keth were about to discover that their 1,000-year reign of terror had finally met its match. 3 months after the liberation of Velros, the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The human fleet had grown from 200 ships to over 1,000, as Earth's industrial might fully awaken to the reality of interstellar. War Commander Sujin stood on the bridge of the New Horizon, watching her mixed fleet of human and Volani vessels prepare for their next operation. The ship itself was a symbol of how much had changed. Originally designed as a human destroyer, it had been modified with Volani shield generators and weapon systems. The crew was equally mixed, with humans and aliens working side by side as if they had been doing it for years. "Target confirmed," reported her Volani tactical officer, Bolin. "Keth Harvester fleet detected in the Nexus system. Estimated strength 400 vessels." Sujin nodded grimly. The Nexus system had been home to the Corvani, a peaceful species of traders and artists. 3 weeks ago, the Keth had arrived to begin their harvest. The Corvani had sent out desperate calls for help, just as the Volani had done. But this time, someone was already listening. "All ships, this is Admiral Sujin," she said into her communications array. The title still felt strange to her. 6 months ago, she had been a lieutenant aboard a patrol ship. The rapid expansion of the human fleet had created opportunities for fast promotion, especially for officers who could work effectively with alien crews. "We know what the Keth are doing down there," she continued. "They think they have time to complete their harvest before anyone can respond. They're wrong. All vessels, jump in 30 seconds. The mixed fleet vanished into hyperspace, leaving behind the empty void between stars. When they emerged in the Nexus system, they found exactly what Sujin had expected: Keth ships scattered across 3 planets, conducting the systematic destruction of another civilization. But this time, the Keth were ready for them. The enemy fleet moved with a coordination that spoke of hard-learned lessons. Instead of the scattered formations that had made them easy targets at Velros, they quickly organized into defensive groups around their largest hive ships. "They're learning," observed Lieutenant Kyung-ho from the weapons station. "These formations are much tighter than our intelligence predicted." "Good," Sujin replied. "That means they're taking us seriously. All ships, engage at will. Show them what we've learned too." The battle that followed was nothing like the swift victory at Velros. The Keth had adapted their tactics, using their smaller ships as shields for the larger harvesters. But the human-led alliance had been learning as well. Coordinated strikes from human kinetic weapons punched holes in Keth formations, allowing Villani plasma cannons to target the vulnerable harvester ships inside. Fighter squadrons led by pilots like Jimin used hit-and-run tactics that the biologically controlled Keth ships couldn't match. On the planet's surface, Corvani survivors watched in amazement as the sky filled with explosions that moved away from their world instead of toward it. In hidden bunkers and ruined cities, people who had given up hope began to believe in rescue once again. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it ended, another Keth harvester fleet had been destroyed, and another species had been saved from extinction. But more importantly, word was spreading. Aboard the flagship Indomitable, Admiral Wu Jin reviewed reports from across the galaxy. The human communication networks were carrying a message that was being translated into hundreds of languages and broadcast on every frequency. "To all civilizations receiving this transmission," the message began, "this is the Terran Alliance, representing Earth and our allied worlds. We have received reports of attacks by an enemy known as the Keth. We want all intelligent species to know that these attacks will not be tolerated." The message continued with coordinates for safe zones, instructions for sending distress calls, and most importantly, a promise that would echo across the galaxy. No one fights the Keth alone. If you are under attack, call for help. We will answer. Junho, the Alliance's first diplomatic officer, had spent weeks crafting that message with representatives from a dozen different species. Each word had been chosen carefully to convey humanity's intentions without triggering panic or territorial disputes. The response had been overwhelming. Species that had hidden from the Keth for generations were emerging from their hiding places. Trading networks that had been disrupted by fear were beginning to rebuild. Most importantly, intelligence about Keth movements was flowing to Alliance command centers from sources across the galaxy. But the greatest change was happening in the fleets themselves. Admiral Chanwu stood on the observation deck of his flagship, watching the Third Fleet conduct training exercises in the emptiness between stars. What he saw would have been impossible just months ago. Ships from 7 different species moving in perfect coordination, their crews working together like they had been allies for decades. The Starbreaker, a massive Villani dreadnought, flew, in formation with the human carrier Enterprise. Corvani scout ships darted between the larger vessels like silver fish, their enhanced sensors providing early warning of any threat. Even a few Keth ships had joined them, vessels captured and crewed by beings who had broken free from the Keth collective consciousness. "Admiral," called Commander Mira from the communication station, "we're receiving reports from the advanced scouts. The Nexus worlds are secure, and the orbital defense platforms are operational." Chanwu nodded with satisfaction. The Nexus worlds had been a major Keth stronghold for over 50 years. Turning them into a forward base for the Alliance had been a strategic masterstroke. Now, instead of launching attacks from the edge of human space, Alliance fleets could strike deep into Keth territory. More importantly, the liberation of the Nexus worlds had sent a clear message to both enemies and potential allies. The Alliance didn't just respond to cries for help. They turned every victory into a foundation for protecting others. In the depths of space, far from any inhabited system, the largest gathering of ships in galactic history was taking shape. The Alliance Grand Fleet assembled slowly, carefully, with representatives from every species that had answered humanity's call for cooperation. Commander Minho stood in the communications center of the Voice of Freedom, the ship that had been built specifically to honor the memory of his sacrifice. The original Minho had died sending the distress call that started this war, but his message had created something far greater than he could have imagined. Around him, communications officers from dozens of species coordinated the movements of over 5,000 warships. The Grand Fleet wasn't just large. It was united by a common purpose that transcended the usual barriers of language, biology, and culture. Everyone in the fleet understood what they were fighting for. They weren't just defending their own worlds. They were protecting the right of all intelligent life to exist without fear. "Sir," called Yuna, the Villani officer who had survived the fall of her homeworld to become one of the Alliance's best strategists. "Long-range sensors are detecting movement in the Keth core systems. It looks like they're massing their own Grand Fleet." Minho nodded gravely. The final confrontation was coming. The Keth had finally realized that humanity wasn't just another victim to be consumed. They were an existential threat to everything the Keth represented. The war that had begun with a desperate cry for help was about to reach its climax. But as Minho looked around at the beings working together in his communication center, humans, and Villani, Corvani, and a dozen other species, all united in their determination to protect each other, he felt something that the original Minho had never dared to hope for: confidence. The Villani had called out in desperation to anyone who might. Listen, they had gotten humanity. With all of humanity's strengths and stubborn refusal to abandon friends in need, but they had also gotten something else. They had gotten proof that the galaxy didn't have to be a place where civilizations hid from monsters and hoped to be overlooked. It could be a place where people looked out for each other, where cries for help were answered with overwhelming force and absolute commitment. The Keth had spent 1,000 years teaching the galaxy to fear them. Now, species across the galaxy were learning a different lesson, that there was something the Keth feared even more than they were feared. They feared the possibility that their victims might stop being victims and start being friends instead. And, as the Grand Fleet prepared for the final battle, one thing was absolutely certain. The age of the Keth was ending, and the age of the Alliance had begun. The galaxy would never be the same.